University. That's completely irrelevant, but I thought it was cool anyway. We were in the middle of theories, right? In other words, the premise is if we can debunk other alternatives to resurrection, and we take care of all of them, then what's left is resurrection. And we had covered several 2 times ago, if I recall. Does anyone remember any of them that we talked about, other theories that have been proposed in the last couple centuries? Wrong tomb theory, Chrysop Lake, hallucination theory, the Pink Floyd variation, what? Stole the body, right? Stole the body we haven't touched yet, but that's the dominant view in the first century, opposed to resurrection, right? Unknown tomb theory, right? There are a number of them. And today we're going to tackle a couple more, all right? Starting with this one here, which you may occasionally encounter if you are speaking to a particular group that is Muslims, because Muslims have a very particular idea of what did or didn't happen. In fact, it's partially addressed in the Quran, okay? And we call this Muslim substitution theory. You may hear slightly different variants on it. That is, some may simply say someone else was crucified instead of Jesus. Some may actually name it as Judas who was crucified instead of Jesus, okay? All right, so let's go back to our chart here. We have our occupied tomb theories, right? And in them is, we said, the myth theory, the wrong tomb theory, the unknown tomb theory, the idea of legend accrual. We said there wasn't enough what? Time. We said with the myth theory, of course, that the chronology was off and that there was really no relationship between these sort of supposed resurrections and an actual physical bodily resurrection of a person, right? The unknown tomb theory, spiritual resurrection, hallucination, and now we add one more to the occupied side of the ledger, which is Muslim substitution theory. And the reason that's on the occupied side is if, in fact, somebody else got crucified and was somehow made by Allah to appear to be Jesus, right, then that means Jesus' body is actually still where? In the tomb somewhere, okay? So that's why it's on the occupied side of the ledger, okay? Okay. This is a funny, not funny, haha, but it is kind of funny, haha. Josh McDowell, who, as you know, is one of the leading apologists really in the country, okay, was having a debate, and he likes to recall this story, so I thought I'd share it with you. And he was having a debate with this Muslim scholar on the resurrection, and he says, "You poor Christians, you don't know where you're going. We go to the tomb of our master and we have his body. You go to the tomb of your master and it's..." I noticed his bewilderment, says Josh, and remarked, "Go ahead, say it." It's empty, right? Which I think was not really where the guy was intending to head, but that kind of made the point. Okay. The Quran specifically claims a couple of things. First of all, it claims that Jesus is a prophet. Jesus in Islam is considered a prophet. Moses is considered a prophet, okay? But he's not the Son of God. The idea to a Muslim, right, that God incarnated himself bodily, took on a human body, right, and dirtied himself that way, so to speak, right, and came down to earth, is completely anathema to Islam, okay? So they don't regard Jesus, the idea that Jesus is co-eternal with God or Jesus is God in the flesh is completely out, okay? So they consider him, though, a prophet. Now, this raises some problems, though, for them. Yes, Cliff?
I just wanted to add to that. I often wonder, like, the Muslims that, for instance, they say that Jesus prophesied, he was sinless.
Right.
You know, he was better than Muhammad, and yet they consider him second.
Right. Well, and that also raises some interesting logical problems, as we're going to see, for them. Because if Jesus is sinless and Jesus is a prophet and Jesus is sent by God, then he can't be telling lies.
Yeah, he did prophesy.
Okay. Right. So if he's a prophet, right, and he's sinless and right, and he's on God's team, then he can't be also creating this massive deception. Right. That's a problem. Sometimes, again, you'll see the Muslims claim that it's either Judas Iscariot or sometimes they'll claim Simon the Cyrenian. Remember the guy that carried the patibulum for him, right? That he was the substitutionary. In the Quran, it just says somebody else, okay? All right? In Surah 157, it basically, just to paraphrase, basically says that somebody, a bystander other than Jesus, was crucified in place of Jesus, but Allah made it seem like it was what? Jesus. Which also raises some really interesting difficulties for the God of Islam, okay, as we'll see. Okay? Okay, there's a few problems with this. Some are logical problems, some are historical problems, and some are moral problems. Let's start with this here. In the Old Testament, which we know is written before Christ, right? We know it was because we have copies that actually predate what? Christ. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls of everything except the book of Esther, which go back to 1st century, 2nd century BC, okay? So we know this is written before Christ, and they contain very specific prophecies about the Messiah dying, right? If you look in Isaiah, obviously, right? If you look in Zechariah and a whole lots of other places, Daniel, right? The Messiah must be cut off before the temple's destroyed. There's all kinds of prophecies about the Messiah dying, okay? So that's a bit of an issue, okay? Jesus, as we know, is continually doing what in the Gospels? Saying he's going to die. I mean, in fact, in one way, if you look at it in kind of a twisted way, it's almost comical how many times he's recorded saying it in the disciples' presence and the fact that they miss it. It's continual. At one point, he even says, I'm going to, get beaten. They're going to spit on me. They're going to crucify. I mean, he really lays it out in specificity what's going to happen to him. Okay? So, not only is he telling it in very specific language, which is recorded in Luke and a couple of other places, right? He's also recording it in the parable of the farmer and the tenant. You remember the farmer and the tenant, right? Where God finally sends his son to check on these lousy tenants, right? And they kill him too, okay? And all scholars, not all scholars, but most scholars believe that that is, right, him basically yet again predicting what? His own death. And by the way, claiming to be God's what? Son. Okay. So here's some moral problems with this. First of all, if the Muslim is going to assert that God did this sort of Shazam substitutionary thing, right? Then what he's asserting is essentially a few things. One is that God is letting an innocent bystander be tortured and victimized, right, in place of Jesus. All right? That's troubling. Second, if God doesn't want Jesus dying, if God is not going to allow Jesus to be crucified, what is the purpose of anyone, what? Being crucified. You see, the substitutionary theory assumes somebody was crucified, but that Allah made it seem like it was Jesus when it wasn't actually Jesus. But if your purpose for God, if you're Allah, and you want Jesus not to die, right, because he's one of your prophets, and you're going to simply raise him up to heaven, right, then there's absolutely no function in the what? Crucifixion. Now, for us, there's a function in the crucifixion, isn't there? Right? We need Jesus to die on the cross, otherwise we're going to hell. Okay, so thank you for doing that, right? Okay, but from the Muslim perspective, right, sinless prophet Jesus, if you're going to just raise him up to heaven, you don't need a substitutionary, there's no purpose in the crucifixion, okay? Allah, who's supposed to be, again, God and perfect and merciful, right, is then allowing this innocent bystander who is being tortured and killed in this horrible way, right? His family and friends, of course, are devastated by this. That's another moral issue. And here's the kicker for me, really, which is if Allah really did this, made it appear as if Jesus was crucified when Jesus was in fact not crucified, then Allah himself paved the way for what historic faith? Christianity. Allah, in fact, established his own competition. Because if Islam is the true path and the right way, right, its number one antagonist in the world, in the pantheon of world religions is what? Christianity. And who would be responsible directly for creating the deception which caused a false religion, Christianity? Allah. But if Allah is all wise and all knowing, why would he set up a situation which is going to result, right, in misleading so many people away from Islam, the true path? You see the problem? In fact, Allah, the Muslim God, would be directly responsible for Christianity, which apparently Allah hates. You see the problem? Okay? So, John Gilchrist, who's an attorney, says, the event, the substitution, served no apparent purpose other than to victimize an innocent man, traumatize the followers of Jesus, and result in the formation of a religion based on a fallacy. So Allah is in the deception business. All of Allah's own scheming and devising highly unlikely indeed. Okay? Here's the parable that we referred to earlier. But again, this is just one of many times Jesus says he's going to die, right? We can go find a whole bunch of times Jesus either hints at or directly says, right, they're going to kill me. Okay? Okay. This guy works with he was actually a student of Gary Habermas. They co-wrote a book together. And he also writes his own books. And he says, since Jesus predicted his violent death and Muhammad regards, it should say him, as a prophet, if Jesus didn't die a violent death, that makes him a what? False prophet. So if he says, I'm going to die, they're going to kill me, I'm going to die, they're going to kill me, and that doesn't happen, then he's what? Wrong, which makes him not a what? Prophet. Okay, problem number one. A fact that would be anathema to both Christians and Muslims. So Jesus as a prophet from God who's sinless can't get it wrong in Islam. Yep.
Do the Muslims accept the fact that the New Testament, where we get all this information from?
Got it. No, that's the kicker. They may come back and say, all right, but you're getting that from what? The New Testament, right? And the New Testament has been corrupted, yada, 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 okay? And that's when our apologetics on the reliability of what? The New Testament would have to kick in. You see? So that we'd have to combo platter, I think. So you're right. His predictions about his death, we're finding them in text that they may be highly suspicious of. But we have good reason not to be highly suspicious of them. So we then have to make the case that they are historically what? Reliable, which we can do separately. But you're right, you'd have to do more than one thing there in that instance. 100% right. Okay? So Jesus predicts his violent death. If Jesus dies a violent death, the Quran is wrong because it says he what? Didn't. Okay? So if he doesn't die a violent death, he's a false prophet. If he does die a violent death, the Quran is wrong because it says he didn't. You see the problem? Okay? All right? So either way, the Quran is in trouble. All right? Again, with the caveat that Chris brings up, which is, right, his predictions about his death are in the New Testament, which means I've got to otherwise historically establish the New Testament. Okay? So if he doesn't die, right, he's a false prophet. If he does die, the Quran explicitly says he didn't die, so it's in trouble. Okay? Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, what they do with, was it Isaiah 52 or 53, where his death is predicted there?
What do Muslims do with it? Well, Muslims, I don't think, probably spend a lot of time on that. We would have to go, first of all, establish the timing of when Isaiah is written, right, which is 6th century BC, which, again, we can definitely put it BC because we have a copy of Isaiah, which is, I think, early 2nd century BC from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's complete. We have like 100% of Isaiah from the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls. And then say, all right, this was written before this happened to Jesus, right? Here's what happens to Jesus. Here's the prediction, you know. But again, you'd have to do this multiple approach apologetics, right? Because they're going to come back and say, wait, I don't trust the New Testament that's telling me he's predicting his death, right?
Yeah, but the Old Testament does.
Right. And the Old Testament does too. So, but again, you'd have to establish when the Old Testament is saying those things, which you can do. And then you'd have to, for that to matter to them, you'd have to establish that this did happen to Jesus anyway. You see? So that we look at Isaiah 53 and go, oh my gosh, there's Jesus, right? Yeah. He's already coming from a perspective that didn't happen to Jesus. All right? So you're going to have to do more than one thing, all right, to get there, okay? but just it's multiple threads.
I'm only wondering.
No, I hear you, but I'm just saying that the Muslim comes back and says, okay, I see this is predicting somebody's dying, right? Okay, and I acknowledge it's written before Jesus lived, right? I just don't think Jesus, it is, but I just don't think this happened to Jesus because the Quran says he didn't die and Allah subbed in, okay?
The Old Testament is out the window.
It's not that it's out the window, it's that there's a multiplicity of things that you would have to do, okay, in order to make the case. As Chris points out, right? If you say, well, Jesus predicted his own death, and they say, he predicted his own death in Gospels that I don't accept, right? Now I have another project, which is what? I first have to have the discussion about why the Gospels are what? Trustworthy. See? So I'm not saying it's easy, I'm just saying these are the threads we have to weave. Yeah?
What are their thoughts on the Jewish leadership in the Romans? Were they lying also?
Well, that's the thing, right? In fact, we could, and this is where Gary Habermas is kind of fun in a way, because he mentioned the minimal facts approach, right? I'm only going to accept the things that all the skeptics accept, right? Let's just say, all right, you could say, hey, let's put the Gospels aside, right? And now let's prove that Jesus died, right? Just from what? Romans and Roman writers and Jewish writers, right? Yeah, you could do it. So I don't know how they'd respond to that. That's a good question, but that would be an approach, right? You could say, all right, fine, you don't trust the Gospels. Let's have that conversation later, right? Let's just look at Josephus, Tacitus, right? You see all these other people who aren't what? Writing the Gospels, right? But they're early historians that don't even like him, right? Who are attesting what? That he died. Right? Because the issue here isn't resurrection. The issue here is what? Death. Right? We can't even get to resurrection until you talk about what? Dying. Right? Okay? So yeah, I think that might be a way to go. Because they might just have such a prejudice against the Gospels that's just been imbued in them. Yeah, Cliff.
Again, back to the other thing is that Jesus Christ is history. I mean, just
Yes.
the way that Abraham Lincoln and George Washington
100%.
you can prove Jesus Christ was here.
Yes, you can. And that's what we have to do. Right, and that's what we have to do. But we may have to use more than one strategy, right, depending on who we're talking to, right? If the person has a hostility towards the Gospels, we may have to use the other evidence first. All right? That's why we're trying to use a multiplicity of evidences, right, to have different arrows in the quiver, so to speak. You know what I mean? For different folks. Okay. All right. Now, we have been basically looking at what we call occupied tomb theories, right? It's in the wrong tomb. It's in an unknown tomb, right? You didn't, whatever you want to say. Hallucination, right? Still in the tomb, right? Now we're going to go sort of to the other side of the ledger and look at empty tomb theories. Now, keep in mind, caveat is, I think we did a pretty reasonable job, and I think the evidence is overwhelming, first of all, that the tomb, in fact, was what? Empty. And in fact, one of the minimal facts Professor Habermas and so many others will point to, right, that critical scholars, meaning the Bart Ehrmans of the world, will attest to is what? The tomb was empty, right? Because really, when you start looking at it, having it occupied makes no sense. So let's just go back over that to make sure we understand that, okay? Dr. Bill White says, the Jewish hierarchy was furious at the apostles' preaching of the resurrection. And you recall they pulled them aside and told them, stop this right now, and then they beat them, right? Remember that whole thing, right? Said, cut this nonsense out, stop preaching this, okay? They did all in their power to keep it from spreading, but their efforts were unavailing. If the body of Jesus still lay in the tomb where Joseph of Arimathea had placed it, what more simple and damaging refutation of the apostles' claim than to show the populace the open grave of Jesus, open it, and exhume the crucified body of the self-styled Messiah? So this is one of the major reasons that even critics who are hostile, right, to the idea of Christianity accept the empty tomb, right? Because it would have been just so easy to do this if you were the Jewish authorities, okay? Okay, Paul Mayer at Western Michigan says, if all the evidence is weighed carefully and fairly, it's indeed justifiable, according to the canons of historical research, to conclude the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, in which Jesus was buried, was actually empty on that Sunday morning. Okay, you get the idea. Okay, so remember our 2 principles. First thing is, if you've got an idea, a theory, a historical model, it's got to take into account what? All the facts, right? It's not good if it explains some of them and leaves off others. The second thing is, you can't take your own personal predilections and what? Foist it onto the evidence. The idea is to look at the evidence and have the evidence speak what? To you. Those are our 2 principles, okay? All right, so here's the conspiracy theory, which was kind of, I guess, revived in a form with the whole Dan Brown Da Vinci Code and all that stuff, right? Okay, so it's got various, it's one basic idea, but you hear different little variations on it. But okay, it is on the empty side, but within the empty side we have natural or supernatural, right? By the way, supernatural only has one entry under it, just so you know. Okay, this is the one we're heading towards, right? Okay, but under the natural side of the empty tomb theories, you've got this idea of conspiracy, okay? And basically it goes like this. This is the original alternative to resurrection, right? Which apparently was cropping up within a couple of days of resurrection, right? If you remember the story with the guards and being paid money to spread this story. And that it is, the body was stolen by the disciples, okay? While the guards slept. Now, this has all kinds of problems written all over it, and let's go over them, okay? All right, here's the Matthew account. And when they had of the original concocting of this story, okay? Matthew says, and when they had assembled with the elders and counseled together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, you are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this should come to the governor's ears, who's the governor? Pilate, right? Don't worry about it. We will win him over and keep you out of trouble. And they took the money and did as they'd been instructed. Now, we said, if you recall, that in the position the soldiers were in, right, they had absolutely no choice but to try this, right, as far as what? Their own personal skin. Because once the tomb was empty, once the seal was broken, once they were gone, whatever had happened, right, they were in trouble. So they might as well have hoped for the best that Caiaphas and the Jewish leadership could use their connection with Pontius Pilate and make it come out okay. Chris?
Since the Roman soldiers were put to death because of the inability to show the body,
Yep.
why did the religious leaders have to give them money? Religious leaders should have charged them money.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I've often wondered that too. You know, why the bribe? Or maybe it was just maybe they had some resistance to saying it, since that would have been a certain death sentence too. I don't know. We don't know. But I hear what you're saying. In essence, from the strictly secular perspective, right? They're doing them a favor. They're the one thing that could probably stand between them and death. So I hear you. I don't have a good answer for it, okay? I do know that Matthew, like the other gospel writers, keeps getting stuff right. So I'm at the point now where I trust that's what happened, right? Just like I trust it was women who, discovered the tomb first, even though, right, that wouldn't be something, right, you would want to make up. You would only say it if it were true, right?
I know everyone here.
No, I know. I got it. No, I got it. I'm just saying my argument, if someone said that, I'd say, I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I hear what you're saying, right? But this person who's writing it has already established himself in so many ways historically to me that when I don't know, I give him the benefit of the doubt. He has earned my benefit of the doubt at this point. So there's plenty of things I don't know, right? But every time I can check something that I do know, they come out great. So at a certain point, and I'm way past that point, I go, on the stuff I don't know, I'm going to trust that he's got it right too, because he keeps getting it right before. Which I think is legitimate, right? You know, in other words, and generally speaking, when we analyze text, the rule of thumb is, unless you can demonstrate that something's untrue, right, they get the benefit of the doubt. So much more so when somebody continually demonstrates veracity in every other way, right? Then when I come to something, they go, I wonder about that. Why did they do that? I need more information. I assume he's got it right. Okay? Just like I assume when he describes himself as a coward and all these other things, that he's got that right too. So someone who's willing to write about himself in this way, right, honestly, right, and make himself look bad and dumb and all this other stuff, I assume that he's not adding irrelevant details for no particular reason, It's a reasonable assumption. Okay, and this story was widely spread among the Jews and is to this day. Now, that's this day at the time of the writing. You know that I think that that's probably sometimes late 50s, early 60s in the first century, right? Some people put it later. Some people put it even earlier, okay? Okay, we start to see some of this in second century writings. There is this exchange between Justin Martyr, who's a Christian apologist, and this guy named Trypho. And Trypho, writing back to Christian Martyr, who's trying to basically do apologetics in this dialogue, says about Jesus that he was a Galilean deceiver whom we, Romans, crucified, but his disciples stole him by night from the tomb where he was lain when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he has risen from the dead and ascended to heaven. So this idea, right, this is supporting what? The idea that disciple stole the body argument was in play early on. Unlike something like Chrysop Lake's unknown tomb, wrong tomb theory, which comes about, what, centuries and centuries later. Okay? So the early argument against resurrection assumed the tomb was empty and assumed the disciples were behind it. Okay? Eusebius, remember him? Our second century. He's real helpful, because what he does is he preserves all kinds of other people's writings. Okay? But he also is arguing against how dopey the disciples stole the body theory is in the early second century, or the mid-second century, I think. He says, conspiracy theory, he says, he's talking as if he's the disciples, and he's talking satirically. In other words, he's being sarcastic right now. He says, let us, the disciples, band together to invent all the miracles and resurrection appearances which we never saw, and let us carry the sham even to death. Why not die for nothing? Why dislike torture and whipping inflicted for no good reason? Let us go out to all the nations and overthrow their institutions and denounce their gods. And even if we don't convince anybody, at least we'll have the satisfaction of drawing down on ourselves the punishment for our own deceit. Now, that's ridiculous, but that's his point, right? He's being horribly sarcastic there. He's saying, essentially, what was their motivation, right? People do things for reasons. What are they getting out of this? The only thing they're getting out of this is misery from a secular standpoint, right? The only thing they're getting out of this is torture and death and hardship and all kinds of stuff. Okay, remember this guy, Chuck Colson? Watergate? This guy had an office next to the president. He was Richard Nixon's special counsel, and he was very much involved in the Watergate scandal. And he actually went to jail, if you recall, over Watergate, okay? And by the way, in jail, or really right before jail, if you read his books, he became a Christian, and he has spent the last 4+ decades doing ministry, and prison ministry in particular he's big into, and he also has written several great books like Kingdoms in Conflict and so on. But he has a kind of a good perspective on cover-up, doesn't he? Right? I mean, he was involved in one, and he says, I know how impossible it is for a group of people, even some of the most powerful in the world, to maintain a lie. The Watergate cover-up lasted only a few weeks before the first conspirator broke and turned state's evidence. And by the way, in this case, nobody's life was on the line. And John Dean and a couple of others just, flipped right over, okay? And that didn't take very long, is his point. The disciples, right, lived years and decades after, right, proclaiming this one message, what? Resurrection, and then ended up dying in horrific ways proclaiming resurrection. The stakes for them were much, much higher, and none of them ever went back on it. And almost all of them paid the ultimate price for that message, okay? And why is that relevant? You say people die for stuff all the time. Yes, they do. But in this case, the argument is that they were dying for their own what? Lie. You see the difference? Again, the guy that flew the plane into the building thinks he's right, but he has no way of independently knowing whether he's what? Wrong or right. The conspiracy theory assumes the disciples made this stuff up and then went out and what? Died for it. You see the problem with that? That's a big difference, okay? Simon Greenleaf wrote the rules of evidence. He wrote literally the rules of evidence, all right? This guy is like Muhammad Ali just died. This is the Muhammad Ali of like legal scholars of his era, okay? He wrote the rules of evidence. Then he applied the rules of evidence to the historical evidence for the resurrection and came out a believer, okay? And he said, the apostles would have broken under pressure if Jesus Christ had not been raised from the dead. McLaren says there's only one explanation: Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. You can't build a church on a dead Christ. Okay. I'm just going to skip through. Now, there's another problem with the stolen body theory, okay? And it is that their lives after resurrection exhibit such an amazing moral constancy from what we can tell of them. Okay? Not only do they die for their belief, but they are consistently maintaining that message and preaching what they're preaching consistently, as far as we can tell from the historical record, right? And some of it is scanty, admittedly, okay? But in terms of where they went, like it's believed Thomas went as far as India, and Andrew ended up in what was called with the Scythians, which is sort of like part of the former Soviet Union, and so on. But their lives don't exhibit, okay, deceitfulness after the fact. Now, the lives beforehand, before resurrection, by their own account, exhibit what? Squabbling, not paying attention, cowardice, right? So before, you've got this muddled group of men who keeps messing up, right? Who then transforms into this band of resolute, right, dynamic preachers like Peter, for goodness sake, who stands up in front of 3,000 people a few weeks after resurrection and preaches to 3,000 people, or maybe more, right? Because we have said 3,000 were added that day, so it's probably larger the crowd than that. All of a sudden, this is Peter, the guy that denies him, right, by his own admission, is now this dynamic preacher who's willing to get beaten and then walks out rejoicing because he got beaten for Christ. Remember that? Okay, so all of a sudden we have this transformation in the lives of these guys, going from this bedraggled group of, confused fishermen and tax collectors, right, into this awesome force of evangelism. And if you ask them why, they say, what? I saw Jesus Christ risen. By the way, forget them. How about Paul? How about James? Now, those two guys actually are more important than the disciples in this respect. Why? James, brother of Jesus, right, and Paul are both skeptics when Jesus shows up to them. And we have recorded in the Gospels and in 1 Corinthians, right? In 1 Corinthians, right? Appearances to James specifically, and of course in the book of Acts to Paul, when he mentions it again in 1 Corinthians, okay? But when you ask them, why are you acting this way? What caused the change? Why are you willing to go to Rome and have them chop your head off, Paul? Right? Why are you willing to stand in the street and get stoned to death, James, right? For your brother's memory, or for your brother's deity, frankly. The answer they give is what? I saw a risen Christ. That's what, you can't get them off of that. So they go from hostile, and in Paul's case, really hostile, right? To what? Laying down their lives for this resurrection belief. Okay, there are people who have examined the life of Paul and come out a Christian because they can't understand how you go from Saul of Tarsus, the super persecutor of the church, right, to Paul, the evangelist to the Gentiles. And when you ask Paul, he says, well, I saw Jesus. Okay? And if anybody was ever primed not to see Jesus, it was who? Saul of Tarsus, a.k.a. Paul. Okay? So J.N.D. Anderson says, nor would it begin to explain their dramatic transformation from dejected and dispirited escapists, this is the disciples, into witnesses whom no opposition could muzzle. It passes the bounds of credibility that the early Christians could have manufactured such a tale and then preached it among those who might have easily refuted it by simply producing the body, and then kept at it for years and years and years, and then died badly for that belief. Okay? If you're in the disciple business, you don't generally die of old age. Okay? You go badly. Okay? Okay. So, to that point, we have historical records from Origen and others, particularly from Origen, that Peter was not only crucified, but crucified upside down. And there's some sort of tradition that he asked to be crucified upside down because he wasn't worthy or something like that. We're not really sure about that, but he was crucified, and supposedly upside down. That hurts. Andrew, crucified. In Andrew's case, it was more the decision of a local governor in sort of a lower region of what was the former Soviet Union, okay? But it was for his faith. He was crucified. Apparently, as far as we can gather, the local governor was kind of mad because his wife had become a Christian, and this guy was really a pain in the butt, and he killed him. James. Remember James the Lesser? Right? James the self-esteem challenged, right? James the Lesser was crucified. Philip, crucified. Simon, crucified. Bartholomew, the guy you never hear about, right? Like you can name 11, and then you're like, and there's. Yeah, okay, crucified. John is the one that survives as far as we can tell. There is some sort of tradition that John was, tortured or actually boiled and then survived or something. But John, as far as we know, dies a natural death at an old age, probably in the 90s, meaning of the first century. Okay? And we know also that John, whenever he does write, and that's debatable, he writes later than the other Gospels. Okay? Everybody agrees on that. Okay? Thaddeus is killed by arrows. James, who's not one of the disciples, but he is brother of Jesus, he's stoned to death. Thomas is spear thrust. Matthew's killed by the sword. And then James, son of Zebedee, is also killed by the sword. And I didn't even put in Paul, who, of course, is put on trial by the Romans and then, as far as we know, beheaded. Not one of them gets off it. Now, again, the conspiracy theory maintains that they what? Made it up. At what point do you go, I was just kidding? Is it when the nail's about to hit your wrist? Me, I'm way earlier than that. I'm just telling you. You don't even get to... if I made this stuff up, right? You raise the whip. I'm like, kidding, okay? I just was having fun with you, okay? They go all the way through to the bloody end, and it is a bloody end, okay? So one of the minimal facts that Professor Habermas likes to harp on, if you hear him, is everybody, no matter who they are, if they're a New Testament scholar, believes the disciples really believed it. You can't think they were making it up. That's why you don't see real scholars running around talking about the conspiracy theory. You see Dan Brown, who writes popular books that gets made into movies and makes millions of dollars on it, but Bart Ehrman's not going to say this, and Bart Ehrman is not on our team. But he's not saying this because it's crazy, because everybody believes the disciples really believed it. But then you got to ask yourself, what's the basis of their belief? In what position are they relative to the information that causes their belief? Right? You see, again, the guy that flies the plane into the building, somebody told him Allah wanted this. Paul didn't say somebody told me. Paul said, I saw what? Jesus. Okay? Peter said, I was on the beach when he was cooking fish. That is a different historical perspective than somebody told me Allah wanted this. The guy flying the plane to the building has no way to independently verify what he's believing. If the disciples didn't see a risen Jesus, they knew that. So if they go behave like this after the fact, you can conclude they really what? Believe they saw Jesus. In fact, most critical scholars in the world will attest that the disciples really believed it. But then the second question is, what's the basis of their belief? Because the basis of their belief is, what are they actually believing? They're believing they personally saw what? Jesus. You see, that's a big difference, right? Either he's on the beach cooking fish or he wasn't on the beach cooking fish. If Peter, who was crucified upside down, didn't see Jesus cooking fish on the beach, Peter had every opportunity to know that. Peter died badly for the belief that he saw Jesus cooking fish on the beach and walk with him on the beach and talk with him on the beach. Peter either knew he did that or didn't know he did that. These are not some sort of, Scooby-Doo appearances we're talking about. He was hanging out with them for weeks. And so if that didn't happen, Peter knew it. And Peter's behavior after the fact tells us that Peter really thought that happened. Because you don't get crucified upside down for something you made up. So nobody who's anybody in the world of New Testament scholarship believes the conspiracy theory. Now, do we have to deal with it? Yes, we do. Why? Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code, right? It's the pop press. But nobody who knows anything actually subscribes to this. The problem is, it's been out there. It's actually been out there since the 60s, too. There was a book called The Passover Plot, which basically Dan Brown ripped off. Dan Brown's book, right, which, the Da Vinci Code, in which he made gazillions off, apparently, right, was basically a rip-off of a premise from this book in the 60s called The Passover Plot, which is basically the same thing. Okay, that somehow there was this big conspiracy to make it look like Jesus, came back from the dead, and that Jesus was somehow in on it, and that drugs were administered to him so he could seem dead but wasn't really dead, because everybody wants to be crucified and survive just so that, it's just insane stuff, but you got to deal with it because it's out there. Okay? Paul Little says, men will die for what they believe to be true, though it may be false. They do not, however, die for what they know is a lie. And they are in every position to know that it's what? A lie, if they're the ones who made up the what? Lie. Okay? Edward Gibbon observes, the resurrection was the belief that turned heartbroken followers of a crucified rabbi into the courageous witnesses and martyrs of the early church. This was the one belief that separated the followers of Jesus from the Jews and turned them into the community of the resurrection. You could imprison them, flog them, kill them, but you could not make them deny their conviction that on the third day he rose again. And if he didn't, they knew he didn't. Because they weren't talking about appearances to somebody else, in the case of the apostles, right? They were talking about appearances to them. Habermas said, well, you get the idea, okay? Liars make poor martyrs. That's the idea. Okay. I'm skipping. Okay. Remember him? He's pretty good. Scalia, who recently died, unfortunately, says, the wise do not believe in the resurrection of the dead. It's really quite absurd. So everything from Easter morning to the ascension had to be made up by the groveling enthusiasts as part of their plan to go get themselves martyred. That's what you're believing. If you're believing the conspiracy theory, that's what you're believing. Okay? You're believing that they are deliberately concocting stuff that's going to get them killed badly. Okay? Okay. You get the idea. Okay. Now, the disciples are not, again, primed to see Jesus. Quite the opposite. It's not just that Jesus died on that cross again. And we want to reiterate this point. It's their hopes and dreams for everything died on that cross. Their understanding of the future died on that cross. Their understanding of overthrowing Rome, right, and a political messiahship died on that cross. The last 3 years of their lives seemed what? Irrelevant and stupid. Okay, so they're shattered beyond shattered when he dies on that cross. And not just because they're upset their friend died. Okay, everything is gone. And so they're in a place where they go from the befuddled crew that we already knew them as to the terrified, confused, befuddled crew. They are in such a deep, dark place 9 of them probably hiding in Bethany, 2 of them hiding in John's house, most likely, right? They are beyond at a low point. There's rock bottom, and then there's somewhere where they were, which is probably below rock bottom, all right? And they're, you know, and as such, and again, we said this was part of the evidence with the appearances, is one of the things, if you were concocting a story, you don't do is you don't write doubt into the story, right? But we have doubt in the story. The reason we have doubt in the story is they doubted. And by the way, it wasn't just Thomas, right? In fact, the empty tomb convinces no one except maybe who? John. Right? We have that episode where John looks in, sees the grave clothes, and believes. Now, we're assuming that means he believes what? Resurrection. And not body removal, right? We don't know that, though. But let's just say John believed. Everybody else is not convinced by what? The empty tomb. So, what are they convinced by? Appearances, right? Thomas won't even be convinced by somebody else telling him, his friends telling him of what? Appearances. And there's 8 guys there, plus whoever else, right? Maybe Martha, right? Some others, right? He's already showed up. Thomas isn't there. He comes back. They said, you won't believe what we saw. He was here. There's many people telling him, and he's what? No. Right? So, what's the point? They're not in a place where they're ready to what? Believe. This is not what they had signed up for. This is not what they expected. They don't get it, right? And they go from that bedraggled mass of confused, terrified chickens, right, to a bunch of guys that to a man basically goes out and gets martyred. Now, what did that? It wasn't the empty tomb, right? Peter looked into the empty tomb. That didn't do it for him. What did it for Peter, right? A personal appearance. Then a reappearance while he was then another appearance on a beach, right? Peter preached what he knew had happened, which was what? Jesus Christ coming back bodily and hanging out with him. And then he went and got himself crucified upside down. The empty tomb by itself would have done nothing for Peter. In fact, it's recorded it basically does nothing for Peter. Right?
It wasn't like a spirit either.
No. Eating, talking, walking. Not just appearing for a few seconds, hanging out. We don't know how long they're on the beach for. They could have been there for 2 hours, 3 hours. Okay? So the point is, you've got to be able to explain historically how these guys, by their own account, go from below nothing, right, to the most dynamic evangelist the world has ever seen. And then lay it all on the line for that. The behavior of the disciples, and add in James and Paul, by itself is extraordinarily convincing evidence for the historicity of the resurrection. Because you need something that can change them from that, okay? And if you ask them what did it, that's what they tell you. Okay? Okay. Here's another tidbit that I think is kind of neat. This is J.P. Moreland. He's very good. He says, the Gospels tell us Jesus' family, including James, who then gets martyred, were embarrassed by what he was claiming to be. They didn't believe in him, and they confronted him. You remember when they're outside the house, and they're basically like, you know, your mother and brothers are here, and basically kind of saying, cool it, could you, calm down, you're kind of embarrassing the family with all this stuff you're doing, right? In ancient Judaism, it was highly embarrassing for a rabbi's family not to accept him. Therefore, the gospel writers would have no motive for making this up. Again, just like the women at the tomb and all this other stuff, right? You don't write that unless it's what? True. This is called the criteria of embarrassment again, right? When you find in texts things that are embarrassing to either the subject, which is Jesus here, or the author themselves, right? It lends historical credibility to it because why? If you were just going to concoct a tale, you wouldn't make yourself bad, and you sure wouldn't make, in this case, potentially from the Jewish perspective, Jesus look bad, right? Okay. The historian, he says, later the historian Josephus, you guys remember him, tells us James, the brother of Jesus, who is the leader of the Jerusalem church, was stoned to death because of his belief that his brother was God. Okay? So we have, from the apostles and the disciples, and throw in James and Paul, we have the before and after picture, don't we? Right? And the before picture is doubt, skepticism, angst, fear, terror. The after picture is what? Boldness, bravery, right? Evangelism. They flip completely. You've got to find a mechanism that flips them all that way. It wasn't the empty tomb by itself, right? And the claim of each one of these guys as to why they flipped is what? I saw Jesus Christ resurrected bodily. He appeared to me. So you've got to deal with that historically. Okay? You've got to deal with how you get Saul of Tarsus becoming what? Paul the evangelist. Okay? And you can't get there by saying they made it up so they could die. Can't do it. Okay? I guess it's a decent place to pause. Okay? I was told next week there's like kids' church or no, what is it again? Children's Day. So I think we're off again and then on. We're doing like an off again, on again schedule now. So I don't think we meet next week, and then I think the following week we can continue on. We'll do a couple more. Okay? All right, Rich, can you take us out?
Our Father, we thank you for this presentation. We pray that you would speak to our hearts, open our hearts, that we may understand these things. It's very important that we can give an account for what we believe. Father, we pray that these messages might stir our hearts, that we may speak to others, because the evidence is there. We pray that you would bless us and strengthen us. Help us to understand your will for our lives as we go out and witness to others. Pray in